Thanks very much, Roman, and welcome to all of you. We had an excellent subscription for today's webinar. I think we had over 75 people signing up, so we're very glad to have all of you with us. My name is George Devendorf. I'm the director of the Disaster Ready Initiative, and it's my job to tell you a brief word about the sponsor of this event, and then to introduce our speaker, Lisa McKay. So I will be brief. The Cornerstone On Demand Foundation, which is sponsoring this event, is also the sponsor of the Disaster Ready Initiative. What you're seeing on your screen now is obviously a brief mention of the Foundation's mission statement. And from what you can see here, I hope it's clear that the focus of the Foundation is really on helping NGOs around the world to do a better job of educating, supporting, and retaining their staff, and by so doing to help them all become more effective in achieving their missions. The Foundation has 3 focus areas, which you see here, and obviously around the final one, disaster relief, is what we'll be focusing on today. Next slide, please. The Disaster Ready Initiative itself is a collaborative effort led by the Foundation, but including the participation of really an excellent group of prominent aid agencies, including NGOs as well as UNHCR, IFRC, and some others. You see some of those logos presented on this screen, but not all of them, just for reasons of space. It's a free, easy-to-use online training resource, and we invite all of you to go have a look at your convenience. You can see the URL there prominently on the top of the slide we're looking at now. It's part of our mission, in addition to providing cutting-edge e-learning for free to humanitarians around the globe, to periodically convene webinars such as this with leading experts in various fields and disciplines within disaster preparedness and response. Next slide, please. And we're very lucky today to have Lisa McKay with us. You can see a very brief summary of her bio here. I think many of you have probably heard of the Headington Institute before. Lisa played a prominent role at the Institute for 7 years, really leading their efforts around psychological and wellness support to, well, frankly, to all of us, to aid workers working around the world. She's a published author and has done quite a lot of thinking on this subject, and we're very lucky to have her here with us today, calling in and joining us from Laos. And Lisa, without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Raman. Hello, everyone. I don't know how many countries you're all calling in from, but greetings from Laos. I suspect many of you are over in the US, and so it's early morning when you are, and I hope your day is off to a good start. In a couple of minutes, I'll be asking you to chime in and share your thoughts about the topic of today, and you can see the learning objectives on the slide there, the topics that we're going to touch on today in the brief time that we have together. The first of those topics is we're going to spend most of our time together talking about some key personal skills and strengths of resilient humanitarian workers. We'll also, near towards the end of the call, we'll touch on some ways in which leadership can help promote resilience in their disaster response employees. And then we'll provide some extra resources that you can follow up on if you wish at the end of the call. So in a couple of minutes, I'll be asking you to chime in with your thoughts on what resilience means. So start to put your thinking cap on that. About that. But let me first tell you a little bit more about my background and why I'm so interested in this topic. I literally grew up all over the world. When I was 7, my parents packed my whole family up and moved us to Dhaka, Bangladesh, so that my dad could take up a development posting. My grandparents were absolutely horrified, but my parents assured them that it was just a 2-year assignment and that we'd all be home very soon. And I think it was 21 years later they actually returned to Australia to live. So since then I've lived in the US, in Zimbabwe, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and in Croatia. And 4 years ago I married someone who had also lived in half a dozen different countries, working in different development roles. And we're currently living in Laos. So you might say that I have a bit of a vested interest in this topic. And along the way, I've met scores of humanitarian relief and development workers, and most of them wrestle frequently with the impact of this work upon themselves and their families. And they constantly question not just whether the work that they're doing makes a difference, but whether they can do that work and thrive as an individual and a family member at the same time. I think you can do this work and thrive as an individual and a family member, and I think it helps if you're intentional and proactive about building resilience. So without further ado, let's move along to the next slide, and let's start there. If you could take just a minute or two from wherever you are and type into the chat box some of your thoughts about what words or phrases come to mind when you hear the term resilience, and how would you define it? So just toss in some words or phrases into the chat. Let us know that you're out there, and let us know what you think of when you hear that word resilience. I'll just give you all a moment to think about that. And you can send the chat either to me privately, or you can chat all participants. It doesn't really matter. I'll give you another 30 seconds or so to chime in with any of your thoughts about what comes to mind when you hear the word resilience. Okay, I'm starting to see a couple of responses coming through. We've had one person wrote in and said bounce back. We've had someone flag recovery, strength, moving forward, ability to bounce back after difficult situations, ability to cope with the circumstances and situations around you. Really all really good responses, and sort of picking up on this common thread of recovery and strength and moving forward. Great. Keep those coming in, and we'll move along to the next slide. And I'll show you the way that I define it. We've got coping well. Great. Really good to see these coming into the chat. Thank you, guys. So this is not the be-all and end-all of definitions. This is just how I have chosen to define it after thinking about it over the past years. And the way I usually define it is the ability to successfully navigate high levels of challenge and change, and to bounce back from traumatic events. So when I think of resilience, I think of two important components that are good to keep in mind. And the first one you'll see on your screen there is sustainability. So that aspect of continuing forward in the face of adversity, that coping well aspect that many of you picked up on in the chat. And the second one is recovery, that aspect of bouncing back. Again, we saw that phrase in the chat, bouncing back after setbacks or traumatic events. So Raman, if you could put the next slide up. And there are 5 points about resilience that I want to make this morning before we move on to talking about specific qualities. And the first of those is that most people are resilient to some extent. So most of us experience traumas or major life stresses at some stage of the game. That's just life. And when we do, it's normal for us to experience some stress or trauma reactions during those times. But that doesn't mean that experiencing those sorts of reactions is inevitable. And it also doesn't mean that those sorts of stress and trauma reactions during difficult times are going to stick around and be problematic in the long run. So even after living through a traumatic event, such as a major earthquake, for example, most people don't go on to develop enduring mental health problems. People are resilient. So it's less a question of whether people are resilient and more of a question of how resilient they are under different conditions. But you'll never become so resilient that you're stress-proof. So no one is stress immune. If you subject people to enough pressure, everyone is going to eventually react with distress and dysfunction. So, one way to think about resilience is to think about it as a muscle. If you work a muscle too hard for too long, then no matter how strong you are, you'll eventually get tired, you'll get weaker, and you'll get injured. So the third point that I want to touch on this morning is that resilience is a process. It's not just one personality characteristic or a skill. Resilience in action is the process of calling on our internal and external resources and using them to respond to challenging demands. So some of those resources are inherited. Some people inherit strengths and temperaments that make them naturally more resilient than others. But with awareness and practice, we can all develop many of the qualities that promote resilience. And the fact that resilience is a dynamic process also means that people who are generally resilient aren't going to necessarily demonstrate resilience in every situation or at any given point in time. So the fourth important thing to keep in mind is that resilience is due to a constellation of interrelated qualities, many of these which can be learned and practiced. So the behaviours, the beliefs, the attitudes that promote resilience are a constellation of qualities. And many of these qualities that we're going to move on to talking about soon are attributes that feed into the development of other helpful attributes in positive feedback loops. So, for example, someone who has regular contact with a good friendship group, if you talk to a good friend or several regularly, you have more opportunities to consider different perspectives, to self-reflect, to exercise empathy, to do things like practice communication and conflict resolution, and all of those different skills and qualities are things that build resilience. So finally, the skills and strengths that promote resilience in different contexts can vary. So there's a lot of research that suggests that there are a handful of qualities, like optimism, that appear to promote resilience in a wide variety of contexts. But in other ways, the strengths and skills that best promote resilience are context dependent. So, for example, a general tendency to be very detail-oriented and need to solve problems exactly so is going to make an accountant maybe more resilient in his role than a disaster relief worker. So what does research and experience tell us so far about the qualities that best help disaster relief workers thrive and be resilient in their roles? So at this point, I want to transition to the next slide. And this is another question for you guys to think about as before we move into, sorry, Roman, can you actually go back one, I think? Back one slide. Yeah, we'll stay on this slide for the moment. Thanks. Before we move to talking about adaptability, a question for everybody that I'd like you to think about and input into the chat box is, what are behaviours, beliefs, attitudes, personality characteristics? What are things that help those in your profession thrive and be resilient? So just have a think about what qualities you think help people to be resilient. And think about colleagues who you feel are good at this work, not just in the way that they do their work, but also in the sense that they live life well. What are some of the qualities that you see and in colleagues you think are resilient that help them to thrive? And I'll give you a minute or two to think about that. And again, you can chat me privately, you can chat all participants. That's no problem, but just send us some of your thoughts about that. Okay, we have Heather says flexibility. Absolutely. Flexibility, and we'll move on to talking, that's actually tied into one of the first things we'll talk about. Good, Liz. Reflective, self-aware, grounded, realistic. Yep. Being patient and self-aware, yep. Keep them coming, and if you don't feel comfortable inputting them into the chat, grab a pen, write this stuff down on a piece of paper. Take this opportunity before we actually go through the research to think about what you feel makes people in your profession resilient. Okay, good. We have some more thoughts coming in, both to all panelists and to me privately. Being solution-oriented, being flexible, being optimistic, being a team player, being reflective, being adaptable, problem-solving. Great. These are all phrases that we're going to see repeated in the next 45 minutes as we talk about some of these qualities. Okay, so Raman, you can transition to the next slide, thanks. As these qualities continue to come in, I'll just tell you a bit about the research that the presentation today is based on. Before we moved to Laos, as George mentioned, I spent 7 years working with the Headington Institute as their Director of Training. The Headington Institute provides psychological and spiritual support to aid workers around the world, and in that role I developed many of their workshop training programs and many of their online training programs, and had the great privilege of spending a lot of time thinking about stress and trauma and resilience and what helps humanitarian workers thrive. When we moved to Laos 2 years ago, I resigned that position, and last year I was hired by a London-based company called People in Aid to conduct in-depth interviews with 15 humanitarian workers around the world and a handful of staff support specialists. And what People in Aid wanted me to do was to combine that research with my knowledge of the literature in the field and then write a report about key personal strengths and organisational structures that support resilience in humanitarian workers. So what I'm going to share with you now are the results of that report, the 9 things that surfaced repeatedly during those interviews and also surfaced in the literature around the burgeoning field of literature around resilience. And the first one that you'll see on your screen there is adaptability. And I think the word adaptability was mentioned more times in my interviews than any other word except maybe perhaps the word relationships. When I asked people on the field, what helps you to be resilient? What do you think are key resilient qualities? Over and over again, people talked about needing to be able to quickly redefine your plans when things fall apart or you face major setbacks without being completely devastated or getting stuck. So this sort of adaptability is actually a picture of resilience in action, because adaptability is the result of a number of other skills and abilities working in tandem to help us deal well with challenge or change. And 2 of the important qualities related to adaptability that surfaced for humanitarian workers that I want to talk with you briefly about today. The first one is the ability to tolerate ambiguity. So the sorts of situations that you as disaster relief workers regularly find yourselves in can be situations of overwhelming need and insufficient resources. There's cross-cultural and other communication difficulties, just for example. And these situations don't often lend themselves to clearly identifying what's actually going on, much less what the best thing is to do next. And as such, an essential skill for humanitarian workers is the ability to tolerate this type of tension and continue to make decisions and move forward as best you can in that environment of ambiguity. And the second quality related to adaptability, that broad theme of adaptability that I want to mention, is pragmatic idealism. And so one of the leading researchers in this field has argued that flexibility and adaptability derive from what she talks about as counterbalanced traits. And counterbalanced traits are paradoxical qualities like pessimistic optimism that provide us with a wide range of ways that we can respond to situations. So pragmatic idealism is an example of a counterbalanced trait that seems to be really important for humanitarian workers. Pragmatic idealism is being able to maintain a sense of idealism and purpose, which seems to be so important to so many humanitarian workers, but also having that idealism tempered with pragmatism in how we adjust our expectations and ideals to the realities of the situations that we're faced with, and how we find ways to take care of ourselves in the face of never-ending demands and overwhelming needs. Okay. Raman, if you could move it on to the next slide, please. So the second quality I want to talk about today is problem solving. And we saw that mentioned in the chat earlier, something that many of you have to do regularly on a daily basis in your job. And Diane Cotu, who is a bit of a resilience guru name, talks about problem solving this way. She says the ability to make do with whatever is at hand, an ability to improvise a solution to a problem without proper or obvious tools or materials. So again, somewhat similar to adaptability, problem solving is the result of a number of different personality traits, decision making and planning skills all working together. And some of the skills that seem to make humanitarian workers good problem solvers in their context include the following. And the first one there you'll see being challenge oriented. being challenge-oriented is a tendency to love challenge, change, and problem-solving. So people can learn to increase their tolerance for change and to deal better with it. People may even be able to develop a taste for change, sort of how some people develop a taste for olives or other foods in adulthood that they didn't like when they were younger. But being genuinely challenge-oriented may be more of a personality trait and a skill, some of the researchers are now suggesting. There are certain people and personalities who seem to come genuinely hardwired to love challenge and change, not just to tolerate it, not just to want to love it, but they actually love it on a daily basis. And these people tend to make resilient disaster relief workers. And the second thing we'll pick up on with relation to problem solving is problem-focused coping. So problem-focused coping involves focusing mostly on the logistics of the problems to be solved when challenges arise, rather than reacting emotionally and then continuing to focus on distress and other feelings for extended periods of time. So some problem-focused coping strategies include being solution-driven and not problem-driven. So people who are solution-driven tend to be action-oriented. They tend to have a can-do attitude, and they tend to shift relatively quickly into solution generating rather than continuing to dwell on the dynamics of the problem indefinitely. And you can see, even as I'm talking about some of these are not, there's not a right or wrong with many of these. If everybody were a solution-driven, not problem-focused person, then often probably we wouldn't analyze all problems in depth. So this is not a values judgment attached with some of these. These are just what the research and experience tends to suggest makes a disaster relief worker working internationally more resilient, and being solution-driven is one of those. The ability to work autonomously without close supervision or clear guidelines. The ability to accept imperfect solutions and partial victories. So disaster relief workers often have difficult decisions to make. And one of the things that can make them more resilient is being able to accept feeling as if they have disappointed and let some people down. And that can be a really hard thing for people. And if it's less hard for you, then that tends to make you more resilient in that particular role. And the fourth one there is the ability to learn on the go. So people who have a knack for picking things up as they go and transferring lessons learned from one context to another tend to do better in this role. So before we switch to the next slide and continue with our third theme, I have a quick question for all of you to think about, input into the chat, to all participants, to me privately again. We'll give you a minute. What attracted you to this line of work? So why did you decide to enter this sort of work? Have a think about that, and if you feel comfortable sharing, just send me a word or two, a sentence. What drew you to this line of work? Thanks. I see a couple of you chiming in. I'll just give you another 30 seconds to get your fingers to the keys or pick up your pen and just make notes for yourself. What drew you to this line of work? Okay, we have a variety of answers coming in, some private, some to all participants, and they're ranging from adventure and wanting to get out and experience the novel to a desire to help people in concrete ways and wanting to make a difference. And that desire to help people in concrete ways and wanting to make a difference is directly related to the third theme that we're going to talk about now, which, Roman, if you could advance the slide, please, that would be great, which is a sense of meaning and purpose. So the third theme that pops up as really important for helping to make disaster relief workers resilient is this sense of meaning and purpose. And wanting our work and our actions to feel purposeful in ways that extend beyond ourselves is a pretty universal human desire. And for many of us, personal beliefs about meaning and purpose and what it means to love and care for other people played at least a part, and often a big part, in our decision to choose the sort of career that we've chosen. So these sorts of motivating drives around meaning and purpose and beliefs around meaning and purpose also remain a strong driving force and a frequent topic of conversation throughout many humanitarian workers' career. So a person's beliefs related to meaning, purpose, and working in line with those core beliefs, that first point there, working in line with those core values and those core beliefs, seems to be a crucial factor underlying resilience. So certain types of beliefs, however, certain types of beliefs and ways of holding your beliefs seem to be especially helpful in promoting resilience in this field. And there are 3 points there, sub-points there underneath the content of core beliefs. If your belief structure is rooted outside ourselves, so there's some sort of bigger picture, if there's some sort of concept of valuing others, and if our belief structure is fundamentally positive, engendering hope, a broader sense of hope in the midst of suffering and disappointment. So humanitarian workers who believe that what they're doing is valuable and worthwhile in that broader cosmic sense, they are the ones, to a certain extent, idealistic, who tend to be more resilient. But this is not the full story on this front. Some flexibility of belief structure also seems to be really important, because it's virtually impossible to witness the sort of suffering and violence and great human need that you often see as a disaster relief worker without having these core beliefs and expectations, whatever they were when you went into this line of work, without having those beliefs and expectations about how the world should work challenged. And many disaster relief workers that I've met tell me that they didn't expect this challenge when they went into this field, and that they weren't expecting these sorts of deeply, you can call them spiritual challenges, to be so painful and so pervasive. So knowing that this isn't unusual is an important first step to coping well with this sort of challenge. And a couple of other points that people have shared with me that can help in terms that's related to this issue of flexibility of belief structure are around, people talk about acknowledging shades of grey, around issues that may have once appeared black and white. They also talk about taking on the attitude of a learner, even when you're in a position of authority, and acknowledging and recognising what you're getting out of the work. We saw earlier, Heather chimed in and said that part of what drew her to this work was adventure. And for those of you who that was a motivating factor for, acknowledging that makes you more resilient. Knowing what you're also getting out of this work and other things other than just helping others, it's a factor that research suggests makes you more resilient. Next slide, please, Roman. Okay, so moving on to our fourth point, and this one is really important. John Fawcett, who's written a book on this and is a very well-known staff care specialist, puts it this way: if social support is compromised, frontline educators are only statistically more likely to be symptomatic of stress and trauma, but the differences are huge. Slide. There's no single factor that will make you more resilient, but good relationships are about as close as we can come to a silver bullet. You can change the slide, please, Roman. So all of the research that's been so far conducted on the experiences of humanitarian workers and disaster relief workers, and there hasn't been a great deal of research, but all of the research that has been so far conducted suggests that relationships play a hugely central role in making people resilient and thriving. One of the studies that surveyed 215 disaster relief workers based around the world compared people with low social support to those with medium or high levels of self-reported social support. And the people with low social support turned out to be 4 times more likely to experience traumatization after a traumatic event, and 2.5 times more likely to be experiencing acute anxiety, and 2.5 more times likely to be experiencing some form of physical illness. So that's pretty startling when you think about it, that feeling like you don't have good social support puts you at more than twice the risk of actually experiencing physical illness. So 2 things. What makes for good social support? And there are just 2 points I want to pick up on this morning. And the first is that relationships must extend beyond mere acquaintance. So this is pretty common sense, really. 850 Facebook friends do not close relationships make. So you must have some relationships in your life that extend beyond Facebook friends. And interconnected networks, communities are more protective. So a family is a good example of a network that's interconnected. When you have an interconnected network, the people in that network know other people in your network. Families, social groups, people that you went to college with, all of these can form interconnected networks. And those networks tend to be particularly protective for people. Next slide, please, Simon. Okay, the fifth quality out of 9 is optimism. And many of you chimed in with this in the beginning, optimism and sense of positive emotion. And we have 3 themes related to optimism that I want to pick up tonight. And the first is helpful optimism. So this is not an unbridled optimism, but it's one tempered by realistic expectations and a keen awareness of possible pitfalls. It's sort of akin to the pragmatic idealism that we touched on earlier. It's another one of those counterbalanced traits that we talked about. The second one is fun and a sense of humor. So the novelist Hermann Hesse once said that humor was the third kingdom where the spirit becomes tough and elastic. So we might not put it quite like that, but many disaster relief workers I know are in agreement that having a good sense of humor is a really big help when it comes to being resilient in their roles. And closely related to this issue of humor is the issue of fun and other positive emotions. And this issue of regularly experiencing positive emotions is related to problem solving in really interesting ways. A psychologist named Barbara Fredrickson has won a bunch of awards for her work on resilience, has come up with really compelling evidence that resilient people use positive emotions to bounce back from negative experiences. So her work demonstrates that experiencing many positive emotions like amusement or playfulness or enjoyment or warmth or affection, experiencing these sorts of emotions during a day increases the planning and decision-making abilities that we have because they increase the range of action choices we can conceptualize. So what she's saying is literally is that positive emotions help us to think more broadly and come up with more action choices, and they also motivate us to try to be proactive. And negative emotions, in contrast, decrease resiliency because feelings like anxiety and anger and fear and vulnerability narrow a person's range of thoughts and limit our action choices. And I'm sure we've all experienced this when we stop to think about it, how when we get very anxious or very stressed or experience negative emotions, we seem to sort of shut down and not to be able to think the way that we normally do. And so Fredrickson has also found, she has solid research in finding that the strengths gained during these positive states as a result of positive emotions are durable, and that they last a long time in the face of adversity and ongoing difficulties. She's even come up with a ratio that she calls the positivity ratio. So she reckons that we need to experience 2.9, she's very specific about this, 2.9 times as many positive emotions as negative emotions to put us in the threat, thriving, and resilience. So you can write that down, positivity ratio of 2.9, and have a think about whether that's true for you. Next slide. So the sixth theme that I want to pick up on today is emotional management. And this is the ability to regulate and manage intense negative emotions. So it's not that resilient people don't experience the stress and negative emotions. They do. Resilient people do experience negative emotions just the same way that people who are less resilient in a role do. But what sets people who are resilient apart appears to be their ability to recover their emotional equilibrium more quickly and effectively. And recovering that equilibrium or being able to manage intense emotions seems to be an important skill for disaster relief workers. And this makes sense when we think about the demands of the job. One humanitarian worker I spoke to recently put it this way. She said, I cannot afford to fall apart when things are urgent. During these times, I get on and I do the job, and then I deal with feelings later. I've tried to get better at making time to pay attention to feelings at some point, though, because if I don't, they just come back in some way or another. So what are some of the ways that humanitarian workers control their emotions during high-pressure situations? And there are a bunch of them, and we'll just mention 4 briefly today. Deep breathing is one. Deep breathing is a really effective, very simple way of sending a message to your body to calm down and undo the stress reaction. Attention control is just what you choose to pay attention to in a situation, and temporarily reorienting attention if something is too distressing. So if you find yourself getting too worked up, one way to deal with that is to just switch the channel and pay attention to something else. Cognitive reappraisal is basically just a fancy way for saying that you change the way that you think about a situation to make it feel less threatening and more positive. And two specific ways that you can change the way that or practice changing the way that you think about situations when you feel that you're getting sucked into a negative spiral. The resilience research suggests practicing gratitude. We've seen a lot about this in the media lately, I think. It's becoming more and more recognized that the better we are at recognizing and being grateful for the blessings, the good things in our life, the happier and the more resilient it tends to make us, and focusing on the bright side. So specifically reorienting away from the negative and looking on the bright side. And the 4th one is delayed emotional expression. So acknowledging and expressing emotions through talking, writing, art, or other mediums until time and safe space allows. Next slide, please. The 7th, we're getting there, 7 out of 9. 7th quality that we're going to talk about is self-awareness. And I think this field staff, the quote at the top of the slide, is a good one. Self-awareness is what underlies knowing your own limits, emotional, physical, and managerial. And this is a broad theme, and 2 sub-themes seem to be particularly relevant to humanitarian workers being resilient. And the first is knowing your own strengths, orientations, and limitations. So this appears to be linked with your ability to manage your emotions, to make good decisions, to problem solve effectively. So, for example, if you know yourself well, you are more likely to make a good decision about which role that you want to take on as a humanitarian worker in the first place. You're more likely to learn from an early mistake, and you're more likely to recognize when you're approaching your limits and to ask for help when you need it. But good self-awareness is not enough on its own, however. The more resilient humanitarian workers are also those who accept and prioritize the need for self-care, those who intentionally cultivate resilience. So those people who take on board these sorts of information that we're discussing today and make their own self-care a priority, recognize that no one else is really going to be able to come along and set the sort of boundaries and limits and do the sort of thinking and know yourself as well as you know yourself and what you need. So it needs to be a priority for you if you want to work in this field in the long haul. Next slide, please. The 8th theme is one so obvious that many people forget to talk to me about it when we're talking about resilience. When I say, what makes you resilient? Of the 15 humanitarian workers I interviewed, most of whom are in what you would consider quite extreme hardship posting places, only one person mentioned nutrition, sleep, and exercise. And these basic building blocks of food, sleep, and exercise are so obvious that many of us forget to mention them. But they're so obvious that when we're under pressure, a similar process can occur, and that we can forget how important that they actually are, and we can neglect to attend to them. So in disaster relief situations, right in the thick of it, these can be particularly difficult to attend to. But it's really worth trying to pay attention to do what you can for these three, because without these basics, as I have learned the hard way in the last year after having my first child 15 months ago, without the basics like sleep, some of your other resilience building skills are going to desert you, even if you're naturally gifted in this area. I sat next to at a conference recently, a conference about spirituality, a very talented senior clinician, and she was talking to me about therapy groups she'd been running for the past decade. And she said for 8 years she ran a group with a different group every year, and she said she ran all sorts of complicated values clarification exercises and helped these people deal with their problems and thrive. And then she said, last year I just chucked that all out and I just ran a group that was coaching people how to eat better, sleep better, and exercise more. And she said, it was the best results I got of any of the therapy groups I've ever run. And I think she was a bit chagrined and also a bit, it had made her rethink the importance of the basics. So take that on board and do what you can. I know it's not always easy to care for these three in disaster situations, but do what you can. And last but not least, next slide, please. The ninth theme we'll pick up on this morning is seeking balance. So balance and pacing appear to be really important resilience themes and skills for those of you who want to work for the long haul, so the marathon, not the sprint. And I find it helpful to think about balance on three different levels. The first is in the moment. So one specific is to pick up under that is to practice relaxing under pressure, and the deep breathing and some of the other skills. When things are really heated, what skills do you have in your toolkit that help you relax in the moment? And then balance and pacing in the short term. So an example of that would be finding ways to successfully disconnect from work at the end of the day. How do you do that now? How do you do that when you're on the field in the midst of a disaster? Can you do that? These are all really important questions to think through and to ask. And the third one is in the long run, to take time off regularly would be an example of a balanced strategy. Take your holidays, make sure you schedule time between assignments, and to work to build in additional sources of meaning to your life other than work. If work is the only source of meaning and passion that you have in your life, that makes you vulnerable. And in the long run, it will make you less resilient, even if it makes you resilient in the short run. So, where are we? We're at the end of the 9 themes I wanted to talk about, and we've spent most of our time today so far discussing avenues to building your own resilience. And that's an important topic, and it's one in our organizations and our managers don't often address, although that's changing. But those of you who are managers are probably wondering not just how you can foster your own resilience in this work, but how you can lead and manage others in ways that encourage them to be resilient as well. So surprisingly, for some people, many humanitarian workers and disaster relief workers don't point to traumatic events as the most stressful part of their job. When you ask people what really stresses them out about their job, most people will talk about organizational factors like team relationships, management style, clarity of mission objectives, agency structure, having a crap boss, that sort of thing. And if you're a manager, you have some degree of influence over at least some of these factors. So in the next 5 to 10 minutes, let's shift gears a little and spend just a bit of time thinking this through. Next slide, please. And here's a question I want you to get back on chat to me or to all panelists. How can leaders help promote resilience in people they are managing? And you can think about this question from any angle you like. But how can leaders help promote resilience in people they are managing? And I'll just give you 30 seconds to a minute to think about that before we pick up the discussion again. Great, we have a couple of things coming through on chat. That's great. Keep them coming. few good suggestions here from Betsy straight up. I'll read them out while you're still thinking and making notes for yourself or for others. Empower them and know your team members' strengths and put them in places and jobs that utilize their strengths for success. So true. That knowing strengths and that person-job fit is one of the best ways that you can leverage resilience in your team members and help them to thrive in their roles. Okay, I'm mindful of time and I want to leave some time for discussion. So I'm going to ask Raman to change the slide and keep any ideas coming through. I see another couple filtering through now, and I'll just go through mine, keep them coming in. We've got asking team about personal practices, promoting and modeling good personal care, yes. Setting a realistic pace and modeling it, yes. These are great, guys. If anything else comes to mind while I'm moving through my 10, please put them in the chat because everyone can benefit from these. We don't have, you could run 2 webinars, 10, you can run PhD programs on this particular topic of managing for resilience. And I've chosen to just put out 10 suggestions, and I've kept them fairly personal based. So I haven't gone to the agency level, but I've sort of thought about what can anybody do in any role, no matter how many people that you're managing. What are the resilience building basics? And here are 10 that I came up with. This is by no means an exhausting list. Well, it can be exhausting. It's by no means an exhaustive list. The first one is listen to staff and try to understand the challenges that they are facing. And the second one is meet regularly with your direct reports. Now, some of you are probably laughing on the other end of this call because the need for staff to communicate regularly with their own managers about work priorities and progress and problems, it's another one that's so basic that it almost doesn't warrant mentioning, except you would not believe how often it's not happening. And there are many things that good managers do with and for their staff, but communicating with them regularly is perhaps one of the cornerstone practices. It's a necessary prerequisite to any more sophisticated resilience building practices, and it's a crucial component to clarifying expectations in both directions and to relationship building. So the third and fourth point I want to pick up is help your direct reports identify their strategic priorities, and using questions assist your direct reports in problem solving some of their challenges. So these two things will help staff feel that the scope of their roles is more manageable and less overwhelming. When you feel that your manager understands the challenges that you're facing and has realistic expectations, it reduces pressure and helps you to feel more supported. The fifth one that I want to mention is find ways to praise and encourage staff. And so given the importance of positive experiences and emotions that we talked about earlier, it's really not terribly surprising that humanitarian workers point to organizational culture and performance management systems that really openly value and affirm staff as key to building resilient managers. So encouraging, affirming, strengths-focused interactions, they help individuals feel positive and safe. This can help people to feel more motivated to meet challenges and to think more broadly and creatively in their own problem-solving efforts. And the second slide that I highlighted, next slide please, Raman. Number 6 is talk about resilience as a priority, model good resilience building practice. And we saw this come up in the chat just now several times from different people, this whole issue of modeling. And you can say all that you want about resilience building and self-care, and people will mostly pay attention to what you're doing. I saw this in action here in Laos. When we moved here, most people in my husband's office left work not before 7. And when he started to set a practice of leaving work at closing time at 5:30, within 6 months, most staff are leaving at 5:30. So your direct reports will listen to what you say, but they'll watch what you do even more closely. So if you model good resilience building practice, if you show your direct reports that self-care is a priority for you, people will pay attention to that. And they will feel that it gives them room to make it a priority for themselves as well. So other ways that you can help your staff to be resilient, ask staff about their own practices. enable and encourage staff to take leave and rest and relaxation leave if they haven't. Demonstrate that you value your staff's relationship with their family and friends. You can ask after family and friends. You can make every effort to grant leave for them to attend family and friend functions when they're requested, that sort of stuff. Encourage your direct report to limit working hours to no more than 50 a week whenever possible. And I know in some disaster relief settings this is not possible. But the research is pretty clear on this point, that when we start to work more than 50 hours a week, our productivity and effectiveness drops off fairly clearly. Even though we don't always recognize that, we tend to think we're becoming ever more productive, but we're not actually, usually. So encourage direct reports and yourself to limit working hours to no more than 50 a week whenever you can. And communicate up. Communicate clearly with your own managers about your challenges and those of your staff. So hopefully this has given you a couple of ideas that you haven't thought about before, or it's helped you to think about some of these resilience building themes in slightly different ways. And before we open it up for questions and discussions, and if you have any of those, feel free to put them in chat, send them to me, send them to George, and we'll get to them in a couple of minutes. But just before we wrap up this part of the presentation, I wanted to challenge you to think about how you might apply some of what we've done here today. Next slide, please. So we have a plan for action challenge. And here are a couple of questions on the screen that I just want you to think about now, and also to think about, to take into today, and to think about today and answer for today. What are 2 resilience building things you've done in the last week? What is one thing you intend to do to build resilience in the next week? And what are 3 things that you intend to do to build resilience the next time you're deployed to respond to a disaster? And along with that, think about what you need to do now or before you deploy to increase the likelihood that you will follow through on this. That's an important adjunct with that question. So I'm going to go quiet now to let you think about those questions. We would love it if you have any questions, put them in chat, and I'll open it back up for George to chime in here with any further questioning instructions soon. Put them in chat. We'll collect some and we'll answer them. And if you could also, if you don't have a question, or if you do, think about what's your answer to question number 2 and put that in chat as well. So what is one thing you intend to do to build resilience in the next week? And just share your thoughts on that to encourage other participants. So before I go quiet and hand it back to George, I just want to say thank you for joining us today. It's both a privilege and a miracle to be able to talk to so many people at once from the dining room table here in Laos at midnight. It's a really fun aspect of my job, and I'm grateful for your time and for your attention, and I hope that today has been helpful. So George, I'll hand it back to you.
Lisa, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation, very thought-provoking. We have a number of questions rolling in, and we have about 10 minutes left. Let's shoot for 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap up. The first question is, how does resilience vary in relationship to the nature of the disaster relief situation?
Oh, goodness. That's a great question. And if I had a really good answer that I was sure was based on research for that, I would probably be awarded several honorary PhDs. The short answer is I would have to do a lot more thinking before I could give you a firm answer on that one, but a couple of things that spring to mind straight away as important to think about is the nature, the length of the response. So experiencing and working with resilience in a 2-week to 3-week response, what will help you be resilient in 2 weeks? It might overlap, but it will also be somewhat different than what you might need to be on a 2 to 3 month deployment. And so I would think about the length of the response is probably a good place to start. And in the longer deployment, I would encourage you to think about how you're going to address those issues of balance and pacing and disconnection. So how are you going to limit working hours if you're deployed for 2 months? How are you going to stay connected with friends and family? Many of us can do almost anything for a week or 2, although if we do almost anything for a week or 2, what you do need to be careful of is then building in some rest and relaxation time after that week or two. So we can do almost anything for a week or two, but in a longer deployment, you really have to sort of treat it also as a different sort of normal and think about how you're going to nurture yourself within that environment, not just save it all up for when you get home. I could go on, but I think I'll pause there and take the next.
No, that's great. That's great. We have two different participants wondering how they could get a copy of this presentation. One person asked in particular, would we be able to access a recording of the presentation? And the answer to that is yes. In fact, after this meeting, I'll send you all a quick note that includes a link to the recording so that if you found it entertaining and interesting, you could share it with your colleagues as you like. Now, another question that's just come in is, this is interesting. I set goals like this all the time, then don't often follow through. Do you have a couple of tips on ways people can improve their follow-through?
Yep, great question. One tip is to visualize yourself following through. It can sound a bit cheesy to sit there and think about, I really want to exercise next week, so I'm going to imagine myself at the gym, on the treadmill. But the research suggests that the more specific you get with your visualization of how and when you're going to follow through, if you actually picture yourself doing something, then the chances are they'll go up that you'll actually do it. A second tip is to write it down and put it somewhere where you'll see it. Put a post-it note on the fridge, put it on your calendar. A third tip is tell someone. Accountability is a wonderful tool, whether from positive or negative. Shame can be a big part of that, and that's not always a good motivator. But regardless of what underlies it, telling somebody helps increase follow-through. And then an obvious one is to be realistic in the goals that we set. If we're not realistic, then we're setting ourselves up for failure before we even start. So be balanced in your approach to change, just as you strive to be balanced in your approach to self-care.
Great. Thank you. Next question. If you had to pick just one or two of the resilience building skills and qualities we've discussed today as the most important, which ones would they be?
Easy. That one's easy, although maybe this is a bit of a cheat answer because I'm going to pick 4. But relationships is one. And the other one would be that slide that I showed you on basics, food, exercise, and sleep. So if you take nothing else away from today's presentation, time spent communicating and building relationships with loved ones is never time wasted. And food, sleep, and exercise are really, really important for building resilience.
Great. Excellent. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, and that question is, okay, this is interesting. You've talked about leadership on an individual level. What about on an organizational level? What are some structural areas or policy areas that are strategic to building staff resilience?
There's so many of these, and we saw a couple of these comments picked up earlier in chat about person-job fit and things like that. I'll just highlight a couple. One is making this topic a strategic priority for senior management and part of the organizational conversation. So this ties in with what we talked about with modeling. People look up and they watch what you do and then they listen to the talk. And if this is a priority for senior management, then it changes the culture of an organization. A second one would be to articulate mission, values, purpose, and use them to inspire staff. So we talked about meaning and how powerful it is, a motivator in many people's lives who are drawn to humanitarian and disaster relief work. And that can also be a tool that you can use to help your staff thrive, is to articulate the mission, articulate the purpose, and help them to feel connected to something that's bigger than themselves. That will really help many people feel motivated, inspired, and more committed and thriving in their roles. The one that we saw earlier, I think it was Betsy that put it up there, is structuring jobs, putting people in jobs where that fits their strengths. And another one is structuring jobs so that the scope is realistic and that the position objectives are at least largely achievable. And when this is impossible, such as in some emergency situations, sending a strong corporate message to staff that you expect them to take care of themselves and limit their working hours. So when people are working in situations where the work will just never, ever be finished, help them set other sorts of limits other than feeling like they have gotten the work done. And the last one I'll mention is prioritizing good recruitment. I guess it's a really important and unusual point of influence in an employee's life cycle, and spending time and effort ensuring good job person fit and clear communication and thorough briefing on the front end will not be time wasted at that point of the cycle.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lisa. A lot to chew on there, but a very thought-provoking presentation. And thank you for everyone on the line for your questions and for your comments that you've submitted. We're gonna wrap up now, but I again just want to thank our presenter, Lisa, for your time, for your advice, for the distillation of so much of your research. Thank you again for making yourself available to all of us. Raman, thank you for driving the PowerPoint presentation today. For all of those who are interested in other or additional resources around resilience and staff wellness, in addition to other topics in disaster preparedness and response, please do visit the disasterready.org website. We have quite a compilation of resources there that I think you'll find of interest.